I'm going to move away from my normal position here and come over here today, try something new. Plus, that's the way the camera's pointed. So today, we are going to talk about appearances. And this will be, I think, a really good conversation afterward because we have a pretty even split between males and females, and that's part of what the conversation is about appearance, particularly makeup, beauty, and the perceptions of those things. So this topic arose out of a conversation, and I'm sure you can imagine a very rigorous philosophical conversation that my wife Jen was having on Facebook about makeup and the perceptions of beauty. And it was spurred by this article that a graphic designer had seen a cover of Girls Life magazine and was appalled by what that person saw there. It was basically, how to wake up pretty, how to have your best hair, and there had been a previous article about that particular cover matched against Boys Life, and Boys Life was all about looking for your future. It was very focused on what's your future job, and it had like space and science and all these things. And the Girls Life was all about makeup and appearances. And so the designer decided to make their own version of Girls Life, and instead of featuring basically a model with makeup and all that stuff, it featured one of the recent winners of the Google Science Project, who is a female, and talked about what do you want to be and what do you want to achieve in your life. And so putting more of the girl's life and the boy's life on parity in terms of focusing on achievement. And so Jen, who doesn't happen to wear makeup, and so I'll state out front, my bias is anti-makeup. I prefer women who don't wear makeup. That's just my personal preference. She basically went out there and raised her concern that for our daughter's sake, we're creating a world where the expectation is that women are valued based on appearances versus boys who are valued based on achievement. And so there are a couple of our friends who are very dedicated to the makeup community for a variety of reasons. Some of them are, one of them is a makeup artist, and one of them actually sells cosmetics, Mary Kay. And so they've bought into this idea of makeup, and they raised some really good points, and we'll talk about some of those today. But I wanted to give you kind of where we started from, so you have a little bit of a framework to build from. And then I'll talk a little bit about the idea of beauty and then how we build from there. So beauty, of course, is not something that's new. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not something that only has existed in terms of controversy since the makeup industry. Obviously, it's something that, from the evolutionary perspective, we look for, right? We have tended to value, and this is still very true today, people based on their appearances, right? Because we translate those things in terms of the chemistry and the sexual health of our partners. So it's not that we can simply say, oh, looks don't matter. Looks absolutely do matter. Anyone who says looks don't matter is, to them, particularly when talking about partnership, is probably lying. Looks always matter. But the question is, why do looks matter today in the context of what we consider to actually be valuable? So that's the one side of it. It's the chemical and the chemical attraction, the sexual side, the things that we perceive mostly unconsciously in terms of our evolutionary bias. The other piece of it is the artistic or philosophical side of beauty, right? So there are things that we see that are beautiful that aren't necessarily related to product or our procreation, but that we still see that appeal to us. Symmetry, ratios, art, landscapes, things like that. Come on in, please grab a seat. And so there are those two sides to beauty that affect us. And I think it's important to realize that our physical appearances, how we present ourselves, depends on a little bit of both of those as human beings, right? Sometimes we want to express ourselves in certain ways, and we do that through the use of beauty or makeup or fashion or expression. But on the other hand, there are also things that there are rules and conventions that we adhere to, and otherwise we face consequences if we don't. So some of the arguments that my wife heard in having this conversation online about makeup in particular and beauty in general are, I do it for myself, right? I do it for me. I do it because I want to feel good about myself. So one of the things that that makes me question that standpoint is, why don't you feel good about yourself to start that you would need to do that? I do it because it makes me feel good. And it makes me think back to cultural programming, right? Culture programs us to believe certain things are true or should be true. So taking this out of the female example, there's a really good, and I'll post this later, basically what's the ideal men's body in all these different countries. And they've done this for both men and women. And basically a person takes Photoshop and they take survey data based on what people should look like, and then turn it into what the same person looks like in these different cultural contexts. And it's really interesting to look at, particularly outside of the US. In the US, we tend to have a fairly unrealistic expectation for what people should look like. And if you look at other countries around the world, a lot of them have a lot more weight on than you would maybe expect in terms of what the ideal looks like. So I think that's a really valuable thing to look at to help to undermine our own biases by saying, oh, there are differences of opinion, so maybe whatever it is okay. And so that makes me consider then, well, what are my own biases, right? You know, I wear clothes every day so I don't get arrested, right? That's where I start. And then I wear certain things because it gives off certain messages, right? So if I wear shorts versus pants, I tend to be seen as less serious, right? Or have less gravitas, right? If I wear a suit and tie, people are going to take me more seriously and think that maybe I have some sort of standing, right? So there are all these implications that come in behind this idea of personal image. But on the contrary, there are people who have achieved, power or status that have gone against the status quo. So if you think about Steve Jobs, right? His classic black turtleneck, it's all he ever wore. I remember reading part of his biography. I think he found it earlier on in his career and ordered X dozen of the, and that's his uniform basically. And coming from military service, I very much appreciate the uniform. I know people that want to get out of it right away. I'm so happy to wear the same thing every day because it's one less decision I have to make. So much easier. But so when you put all those things together, it does really make me question what our programming is. What signals have we received from the world, either consciously or unconsciously, that tell us you have to dress and appear and do makeup in certain ways to achieve what you want to achieve in the world? Now, there are real consequences, I think, to the programming that we've received, right? So in terms of our unrealistic expectations for what people should look like, there's obviously eating disorders, issues with self-esteem. And then, of course, there's also discrimination. And it's realistic, and it's both if you do conform and if you don't conform, right? So people who don't wear makeup at work or don't dress a certain way at work are going to be perceived and taken less seriously. There was an article that looked at tip earnings for women in the service industry. And there was a significant difference for women to wear makeup and not wear makeup. Women who wore makeup made significantly more tips. So there are real-world consequences to making this choice. And so it's not something as easy as saying, oh, makeup is bad because the industry has programmed you to wear it. No, not at all. There are realities that we have to face. But it is something to consider that that's the expectation set, and it's something that our culture actually makes a reality. There's also racism in terms of who you see on, beauty magazines or who you see in TV and media, right? We have this certain expectation based on what we think beauty is. And so that contributes to the discussion on racism because, particularly in the U.S., particularly in history, there have been primarily white people on the screen, in pictures, in magazines. I think the movie industry has started moving in a direction where they've been more inclusive, but that's been the way that it's been portrayed, is this is the ideal beauty. Light-skinned, light eyes, and if you're not that, then you should question your value. And then, of course, there's, many of you have probably heard the woman tax or the female tax, right? Things that are pink cost more. Things that are designed for women cost more. Things that are associated with weddings cost more and are specifically geared towards women. But I want to expand that a little bit, because it's not just women, it's anything that the mainstream, and the mainstream in this case being white males, considers to be deviant. Someone who doesn't want to dress the way that people in power think they should end up getting charged more, and it costs them their time and their money to be who they want to be. Right? So when you think about women's products, they simply cost more than comparable ones. And so if you think about women putting on makeup in the morning and the expectation that they should do their hair and dress certain ways, right? There's the stereotype that, if you want to take a woman out for a date, you've got to plan an extra hour ahead of time so that she'll be ready. But when you think about that from a societal perspective, that's a time tax put into place on women to meet the expectation. And then if they choose not to do that and maybe say, create a better world for tomorrow, well, then they're going to have to face the discrimination, the comments, and a lot of times particularly from women, if they don't conform. So you either spend your time or you have to deal with all of these consequences. So we're setting up a fairly unrealistic and unfair, I think, expectation. And then to me, the biggest consequence of this discussion of the expectations for society is that we're setting our values based on looks. When I think about what things are going to save humanity for the future, right? We've talked about this before. There are 4 major things that are going to threaten humanity: nuclear war, space-based threats, so eventually we got to get off the planet, disease, and climate change. And none of those things are going to be solved by looking real good. So to me, when I'm thinking about what's actually valuable to humanity's progress, it's not how we look, and yet we spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about how we look. So I think that's really the biggest consequence, is that we're misaligning our values in our investment in what we think is valuable to then go on to, or I would say we're squandering that time that we could be using to put forward to save humanity. So then specifically, how have we been programmed in this way? What is it that makes us so susceptible to this programming? Well, I think for humans, there's this desire to want to belong, right? That we're social creatures. We belong to societies. We live and we thrive in groups. And groups throughout history and still today tend to form around people that are like them. So there's this very strong pressure to conform. Now, historically, we've done that based on how we see each other, right? Literally on our visual appearance. You look like me, so I can trust in you a little bit more because I think your values are going to align with mine. Now, people don't necessarily think that to themselves consciously, but that's how they operate. And so, industry in this case has always sold us on what we lack, right? If we want to belong to a certain group and we lack something, we're going to try and make up for that to fit in better. Because in the evolutionary psychology or psychological sense, we have to fit in to survive. A human by themselves is extremely vulnerable. But in today's modern society, most people can survive just fine on their own because of our amount of excess that we have. But there's still this very important drive to fit in. And so instead of trying to fit in to survive due to sharing resources or whatever it is, today we fit in and we do that by either buying or acting in the way that makes us socially comfortable. And I think that's a really important thing to realize, that the need is still there, or the desire is still there, but it's not based on the same need. And then, of course, if you've ever heard of FOMO, if anyone doesn't know what FOMO is, it's the fear of missing out. And the fear of missing out is really, I think, based on that need to conform and to fit in with everyone else. So one of the things I'd ask is, what is it that we actually need to fit into today, right? Our basic needs are taken care of. Most of us can find shelter and food and even a little bit of companionship. We don't have a huge need to fit into mainstream society, because mainstream society isn't really a thing, right? We have our own little groups of friends that we have, and that's usually enough if we realize it as such. So to me, the thing we actually need to be fitting into and creating the future for is humanity, right? I need to be part of humanity, but I have to examine my biases and realize that everyone in this room is humanity, right? Not that the camera can see, but we have many different skin tones, we have different genders, and every single person in this room is humanity. We all have something that we could contribute, and it's hard. So I grew up in a very, very white town in northern Michigan. I think we had one black family, and we had a couple of kids in our school who were of Hispanic descent, but they were adopted by Polish people. So not a lot of diversity. And so it's interesting for me now to look back on what I knew about race then, which was almost nothing, and what I know now, which is slightly more than nothing. And then think about, how has that affected me? And now what do I see as human? I've been fortunate enough to travel and realize people struggle in the same ways wherever they are, from Afghanistan to the Middle East to Europe to here. Everybody's trying for the same things. So I think that's where we actually need to fit in, is humanity. So one of the things that I want to address is this idea that you have to fit in. There's always going to be a struggle between fitting in today to live your life and not have to fight the good fight every single day. Sometimes you just got to get stuff done. Sometimes you just got to make ends meet. Sometimes you just got to pay your rent. Sometimes you just got to do the job you got. And I get that. But sometimes you've got to set a better future for tomorrow. Sometimes you've got to fight the fight so that your kids can have a better future where they don't have to deal with this as much. And I'm not here to tell you what the answer is. The answer is not, shut down all the makeup factories today. This is something that each of you will have to struggle with, but it's something that we should hold consciously in our mind as a struggle. All right, how much am I just sitting around conforming to whatever, programming inputs I'm receiving, versus how am I making change for the future of humanity? And it doesn't have to be your kids. It could be for your friends. It could be for your nieces. It could be for yourselves. And this is really hard because this appearances in particular is enforced by both internal and external pressure. You've got the things that are already programmed in your head, and those things are the most nefarious and the most difficult to change. I think we're getting a little bit better at recognizing external influence. I don't think people respond nearly as well to ads as they used to in early advertising history. We know people are selling us something. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, who's selling us what, and what are we selling ourselves? And then what are we buying, and what future does that get us? So there's another journal that talked about, this was again related to makeup, that there were constraints, this is a direct quote, constraints imposed by the workplace effectively limit the possibilities for resistance. There are people in jobs who cannot be themselves. We actually talked about that last week a little bit. And that's okay. That's maybe not the place to have the fight. But we have to realize that these barriers are in place. So as we continue to reflect on this, and as you take this home with you today, what I'd ask is first that you reflect on your biases. Think about the programming you've received over your lifetime, from your family, from TV, from movies, from reading, from just what you see every day. It's really important to constantly question the biases that you have. If you don't, then it's really difficult to change your mind in a way that you want to be more effective in your life. And then ask yourselves, what should we look like and why? Why do I wear this kind of clothing? Why do I drive X car? Why do I do what I do? I know personally I've struggled with this in trying to think, what is actually most productive? What kind of car is best for me to do the things that I want to actually do, including, taking care of the environment? what kind of clothes do I actually want to wear? Personally, I like stuff that's practical as much as possible. So like these are more like hiking pants material. They're still kind of nice. They get me by, but they're a negotiation between the expectations that are set for me and what I actually want to do. So try and be really deliberate about what you want to look like and why you want to look that way. And then conform to valuing each other and yourself as human, as opposed to conforming to culture. Right? Culture is just what everyone holds as being real in terms of perceptions today. But what we really need to conform to is this ideal of advancing humanity and being inclusive about it. And finally, fight between living today and changing tomorrow. Thanks.